The king has broken his silence, and what he just said has sent shockwaves through every corner of Britain. While farmers stand in muddy fields facing arrest warrants and ordinary voters find police at their doorsteps for speaking their minds, the monarchy has finally chosen a side. This isn't about politics anymore. This is about power, control, and a government that's decided dissent is now a crime. What happened in the last 60 minutes will change Britain forever. And if you think this doesn't affect you, you're about to discover just how wrong you are. The establishment is making its move, and they're not asking for permission. Keir Starmer's government has just crossed a line that many thought was unthinkable in a modern democracy. Reports flooding in from across the countryside confirmed that arrest operations targeting British farmers have commenced, not for violence, not for destruction, but for the crime of refusing to be silenced. These are the same farmers who've fed this nation for generations, who work dawn to dusk in conditions most of us couldn't endure for a single day. Their offence: standing up against policies that would destroy their livelihoods and speaking out against a government that seems determined to crush rural Britain under the weight of regulations and taxes designed to push them off their land. The inheritance tax changes announced in the recent budget aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They represent a death sentence for family farms that have been passed down through generations. Farms worth millions on paper, but generating modest incomes are suddenly facing tax bills in the hundreds of thousands. The only way to pay: sell the land, break up the farm, end the legacy. And when farmers dared to bring their tractors to London, when they dared to stand in Parliament Square and demand their voices be heard, Starmer's response wasn't dialogue, it wasn't compromise, it was intimidation, threats, and now arrests. But here's where this story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. The king, who has remained carefully neutral on political matters since ascending to the throne, has reportedly expressed deep concerns about the government's actions. Palace insiders are whispering about private conversations where His Majesty made his displeasure abundantly clear. The monarchy has always had a special relationship with the countryside, with farming communities, with the rural traditions that form the backbone of British identity. Charles has spent decades championing organic farming, environmental stewardship, and the preservation of rural life. To see farmers treated as criminals for defending their way of life has struck a nerve at the highest level of the British establishment. Sources close to the palace describe the king as furious, using language in private that would shock the public if they heard it. The careful constitutional balance that keeps the monarchy. The arrests aren't limited to farmers. In what can only be described as a chilling expansion of state power, ordinary voters who have expressed opposition to government policies on social media, at public meetings, and even in private conversations are finding themselves under investigation. The justification: hate speech laws, public order offences, and new regulations around online safety that were supposedly designed to protect vulnerable people, but are now being weaponised against political dissent. A grandmother in Yorkshire shared a post criticising immigration policies and found 2 police officers at her door the next morning. A teacher in Manchester questioned gender ideology in schools during a community meeting and now faces a formal investigation that could cost him his career. A small business owner in Cornwall criticised the net zero agenda, and suddenly his accounts are being audited and his permits are under review. This is the reality of Starmer's Britain, where the wrong opinion can destroy your life, where speaking your mind can make you a target, where the government has decided that certain thoughts are simply too dangerous to be allowed. Over politics is straining under the weight of what's happening on Britain's streets and farms. The timing of these operations is no coincidence. Starmer's government is facing the worst approval ratings of any new administration in modern history. The promises made during the election campaign have evaporated like morning mist. The economy is stagnating. Illegal immigration continues unabated. Crime is rising. And public services are crumbling despite massive tax increases. The British people are angry, and that anger is manifesting in protests, in social media campaigns, in a growing movement of ordinary citizens who've had enough. So the government's response isn't to address the concerns, isn't to change course. isn't to listen to the people they're supposed to serve. Instead, they've decided to criminalise opposition, to make examples of those who dare to speak out, to send a message that dissent will not be tolerated. It's a playbook we've seen before in other countries, in other times, and it never ends well. But Starmer seems convinced that he can succeed where others have failed, that he can suppress the growing discontent through fear and force. What makes this moment so extraordinary is the convergence of multiple crises hitting simultaneously. The farmers' revolt isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a broader awakening among working class and middle class Britons who feel betrayed by a political class that promised change, but delivered more of the same establishment control. The cultural wars over immigration, identity politics and traditional values have reached a boiling point. The economic squeeze from inflation, taxation and declining living standards has pushed millions to the breaking point. And now the government's authoritarian response to legitimate protest has added fuel to a fire that's already burning out of control. The establishment thought they could manage this, contain it, control the narrative through friendly media and coordinated messaging. But something has shifted. The old tactics aren't working anymore. People aren't believing the official stories. They're seeing through the propaganda. They're connecting with each other, sharing information, organising resistance, and most dangerous of all for the powers that be, they're losing their fear. The King's reported intervention represents a constitutional crisis in the making. Britain's unwritten constitution depends on delicate conventions and understandings between the monarchy, parliament and the people. The sovereign is supposed to remain above politics, to offer counsel in private while maintaining public neutrality. But what happens when a government begins acting in ways that threaten the fundamental compact between the state and its citizens? What happens when laws designed to protect are twisted into weapons of oppression? The monarchy exists not just as a symbol, but as a final safeguard, a reminder that power ultimately derives from something beyond the temporary majority in Parliament. Charles understands this in ways that politicians never can. His connection to the land, to tradition, to the continuity of British life gives him a perspective that transcends election cycles and political fashions. And what he's seeing now deeply troubles him. The targeting of farmers isn't just bad policy, it's an attack on a way of life that the monarchy has protected and championed for centuries. The leaked reports of the King's anger have sent the government into panic mode. Downing Street has been frantically trying to arrange a meeting between Starmer and His Majesty, hoping to smooth over the tensions before they become public knowledge. But the palace has been notably slow in responding to these requests. A delay that speaks volumes to those who understand how these institutions operate. Meanwhile, senior royals have begun making carefully calibrated public appearances at agricultural shows, farming communities and rural events. Nothing is said directly, but the message is clear to anyone paying attention. The royal family stands with the countryside, with tradition, with the people who are now being branded as criminals simply for defending their heritage. This subtle communication is classic British establishment manoeuvring, but it's also something more. It's a line being drawn, a warning being issued that the government is overstepping bounds that even a constitutional monarchy cannot ignore. What's happening to the farmers is particularly egregious because it targets the most law-abiding, hard-working segment of British society. These aren't radicals or extremists. They're people who've spent their entire lives producing food, managing the landscape, preserving the countryside that defines so much of British identity. The average farmer works over 60 hours per week for an income that's often below minimum wage when calculated hourly. They do this not for profit, but for love of the land, for tradition, for the satisfaction of continuing something their ancestors built. And now they're being told that this legacy must end, that the farms must be broken up, that centuries of family history must be sacrificed on the altar of progressive taxation and environmental ideology. The government claims these policies are about fairness, about making the wealthy pay their share. But wealthy farmers are a myth. Asset rich and cash poor describes the reality. Land values have been inflated by decades of development pressure and wealthy investors buying countryside estates, but working farms generate modest returns at best. The inheritance tax changes will force sales that destroy family farms while allowing corporate agriculture and foreign investors to gobble up British farmland at bargain prices. The arrest operations have been carried out with a level of force that seems designed to intimidate rather than simply enforce the law. Farmers who organised protests have been visited by multiple officers, had their social media accounts scrutinised, been questioned about their political views, issues and associations. Some have been told explicitly that continued activism will result in increased scrutiny of their farm operations, their tax affairs, their compliance with the mountain of regulations that govern modern agriculture. This is how authoritarian control works in a democracy. You don't need to arrest everyone, you just need to make examples of enough people that others get the message and silence themselves. It's chilling, it's un-British, and it's happening right now in towns and villages across this country. The farmers who've been targeted aren't backing down, though. If anything, the arrests have hardened their resolve and expanded their support base. Britons have always had a stubborn streak when it comes to standing up to bullies. And Starmer's government is learning that lesson the hard way. The parallel crackdown on voters expressing political opinions represents an even more fundamental assault on British liberty. The right to criticise the government, to question policies, to express unpopular views has been a cornerstone of British freedom since before democracy itself. The Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, centuries of common law tradition all point toward the same principle. The state cannot criminalise thought and speech without destroying the foundations of free society. Yet that's exactly what's happening under the guise of preventing hate speech and maintaining public order. The definitions of these offences have been stretched beyond recognition. What was meant to stop genuine incitement to violence is now being used against anyone who questions progressive orthodoxy on immigration, transgender issues, climate policy or a dozen other topics where dissent has been effectively criminalised. The police have become thought enforcers, spending resources investigating social media posts and attendance at peaceful protests, while actual crime goes unsolved and criminals walk free. The priorities couldn't be clearer. The government fears its own people more than it fears lawlessness. The British public is waking up to what's being done in their name and to them. Poll after poll shows massive disapproval of the government's direction. But more importantly, there's a growing sense of betrayal and anger that transcends normal political disagreements. People feel lied to, manipulated, and now threatened. The promises of competent governance after years of conservative chaos have given way to authoritarian overreach and economic mismanagement. Starmer campaigned as a moderate, a serious administrator who would restore trust and stability. Instead, he's revealed himself as an ideologue willing to use state power to crush opposition and advance an agenda that most Britons never voted for. The gap between what was promised and what's being delivered has created a legitimacy crisis. Governments can survive being unpopular. They cannot survive being seen as illegitimate, as imposters who gain power through deception. That's the dangerous territory Starmer is entering, and the King's reported concerns suggest that the establishment recognises the danger, even if the government doesn't. The historical parallels are impossible to ignore for anyone with even a passing knowledge of British history. Throughout the centuries, whenever governments have become too detached from the people, too arrogant in their exercise of power, too convinced of their righteousness to tolerate opposition, the British people have eventually pushed back. Sometimes this has been through the ballot box, sometimes through mass movements and protests, and sometimes through more dramatic confrontations that reshape the nation. The current government seems to believe it can avoid these historical patterns through control of institutions, friendly media, and the machinery of state power. But history suggests otherwise. The harder you squeeze, the more determined resistance becomes. The more you criminalise normal political activity, the more you radicalise ordinary people who never considered themselves activists. Starmer's approach is creating the very crisis he claims to be preventing, turning mild-mannered farmers and concerned citizens into a resistance movement that grows stronger with each arrest and each overreach. The King's position in all this is extraordinarily delicate. If he remains silent, he risks being seen as complicit in the erosion of British liberties and the persecution of his subjects. But if he speaks out too directly, he risks dragging the monarchy into political controversy and giving the government grounds to question the constitutional settlement. The careful balance he must strike involves making his concerns known through private channels while ensuring that his public actions send unmistakable signals about where his sympathies lie. The increased royal presence in farming communities, the timing of certain speeches and engagements, the people chosen to receive honours and recognition, all of these become communication tools that bypass normal political channels. It's a uniquely British way of wielding influence, subtle and indirect, but understood by everyone involved. The fact that these signals are now being sent suggests that palace patience with the government's actions is wearing thin. The monarchy's survival over centuries has depended on maintaining its connection with the British people, and Charles understands that remaining silent while his subjects are persecuted would sever that connection in ways that might prove irreparable. What's particularly disturbing is how normalised this level of state control has become in such a short time. A few years ago, the idea that British police would arrest people for social media posts or that farmers would be criminalised for protesting would have seemed absurd. Now it's happening so frequently that it barely makes headlines unless the cases are particularly egregious. This normalisation of authoritarianism is perhaps more dangerous than the specific policies themselves. When societies accept that the government can control speech, monitor communications, criminalise dissent and target political opponents, they've already lost the most important battle. The specific freedoms being curtailed today are significant, but the precedent being established is catastrophic. Future governments will have an infrastructure of control and a legal framework of suppression that can be turned toward any purpose against any group in service of any ideology. Breaking these chains once they're fully forged becomes exponentially harder than preventing them from being created in the first place. The economic implications of what's happening to farmers extend far beyond the agricultural sector. Britain imports over half its food, a strategic vulnerability that becomes terrifying in an uncertain world. Destroying family farms doesn't mean food production disappears. It means it shifts to corporate agriculture focused on profit margins rather than food security. Or it shifts overseas to countries that may not always be friendly or reliable trade partners. The government talks about food security while implementing policies that guarantee food dependence. It's madness dressed up as progressive policy, and it's being pushed by people who've never grown anything, never worked the land, never understood what it takes to feed a nation. The farmers understand these realities in their bones. They know that once farmland is sold off and developed, it's gone forever. They know that agricultural knowledge and skills take generations to develop and can be lost in a single generation of broken succession. They're fighting not just for themselves, but for Britain's future food security and independence. The international dimension adds another layer of concern. Other Western democracies are watching Britain's descent into authoritarian control with a mixture of alarm and interest. Some see it as a warning, a cautionary tale of how quickly liberal democracy can be undermined when the wrong people gain power. Others see it as a model, a demonstration of how modern surveillance technology and hate speech laws can be weaponised to suppress dissent while maintaining a veneer of democratic legitimacy. Countries from Canada to Australia to several European nations are dealing with similar tensions between government power and popular resistance. What happens in Britain matters beyond British shores because it sets precedents and provides blueprints. If Starmer succeeds in crushing opposition through criminalisation and intimidation, other governments will take note and follow suit. If he fails, if the British people resist successfully, it sends a different message about the limits of state power and the resilience of free societies. The role of media in all this cannot be overstated. Much of the mainstream press has been complicit in downplaying government overreach, smearing protesters as extremists, and generally carrying water for an administration that's clearly lost its way. But alternative media, social media, despite increasing censorship and word-of-mouth communication, are providing channels for information that contradicts official narratives.